feel like we should have some music as everyone kind of enters. Hi, everybody. We're just gonna let some more people come in, and then I will start talking.
Hans Zimmer probably would be good. Really portentous.
Oh, definitely.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
All right. Good evening, everyone. I'm Liz Hoddle. I'm the Director of Events and Marketing, and welcome to Politics and Prose Live, where we continue our commitment to crucial conversations in a slightly different setting. Can I just say that I'm actually on the bay right now, and I can, the whole time there's been a heron right outside my window. And I'm tempted to take my computer out to show you all, but I don't want to because I don't want to take away from why you're here, which is to welcome Helen Macdonald back to Politics and Prose with Ed Yong. At any time, at any time you can ask a question down at the bottom of the screen. You'll see the little Q&A tab, and we'll go through as many questions as we can. You can also click on the link in the chat to purchase Vesper Flights on P&P's website. If you are here, then you've already bought a book, but we do have a couple of book plates left, and if you buy one tonight, you can still give it as a present to someone in your life that deserves it. Helen Macdonald first came to the attention of the world for her unforgettable memoir, H is for Hawk, which is a book I personally love very deeply. Since then, she's become a necessary voice for the natural world through her scholarship, television and documentary presenting, poetry, her column in the New York Times, and now with Vesper Flights, a collection of her essays which feels like it has come to us right when we needed it most. Ed Yong is an award-winning science journalist whose work in The Atlantic during the pandemic has also brought reality, clarity, and explanation when we've needed it most. He's also the author of I Contain Multitudes, which examines the partnerships between animals and microbes. And tonight, as I was doing research, I also just found out that he has a Chatham Island black robin named after him. So I'm very much hoping at some point tonight we can talk about that as well. But first, we're going to play you a video.
Someone once told me that every writer has a subject that underlies everything they write. It can be love or death, betrayal or belonging, home or hope or exile. I choose to think that my subject is love, and most specifically, love for the glittering world of non-human life around us. So my last book, H is for Hawk, was a memoir. My new book, Vesper Flights, is something very different. Although there's personal stuff right the way through it, it's a collection of essays. I used to shudder at the word essay. I hated it. It reminded me of school days, and I was the kind of kid who never did their homework on time. I used to get in constant trouble. But I've learned to really love essays and what they are. It seems to me that they can do things that longer pieces of writing really can't. The word comes from the French word meaning to attempt or to try. And essays really seem to be attempts in fierce, concentrated attention. They're things fashioned out of love and curiosity and wonder. Every essay in this book is an attempt to capture the astonishing beauty and variety of the world around us, and is like one half of a conversation that I want to have with you, the reader. Essays are a bit like finding interesting things on a walk like this. They're like those moments where your attention is drawn from the sort of background blur onto something singular and unusual. And you want to pick it up and look at it and try and understand what it is and what it means. And what I've got here is a wood pigeon egg. And you can tell from the way that it's kind of like it's got a very clean round hole in it, it's serrated around the edges, that this egg hatched successfully. And the reason it's here by the side of the lane is that one of the adult birds will have picked it up from the nest and flown off and dropped it, because it's such a bright shell it would attract the attention of predators. So basically, the fact that it's lying here is a little bit of protective safety for a pigeon. And like an essay, there's just so much joy in sharing things like that with others. Such a fun thing to find. Vesper Flights has essays on everything from deer collisions to migraines to glowing beetles to ancient fens, total eclipses of the sun. In it, I climb the Empire State Building to watch birds. I travel with scientists to explore ways of finding life on Mars. I investigate the nature of divinity, and I get more than a little obsessed with swans. The title comes from one of the essays. Vesper flights are the dizzyingly high dawn and dusk ascents of swifts, perhaps the most aerial birds on Earth. Swifts make these flights for a reason, to assess where they are and forecast oncoming weather, and I hope my book does something similar. By paying careful attention to what is around us, it might speak to what is waiting out there on all our horizons. Writing Vesper Flights was fascinating, but something really strange and magical happened when I began to assemble all of the pieces into a collection. They began to speak to one another about the book's deepest themes, and they're themes that course through today's historical moment. They're themes of exile and love and belonging and needing and hope and home. But there are funny things in it too, like the notorious story of the goat at the zoo. It's not just a book about nature. It's a book about where we are now and how we can sustain hope when it seems in such very short supply. I really hope that you enjoy it.
Please help me welcome Ed Yong and Helen Macdonald.
All right, well, that was an amazing video. I love that.
Oh, it's like a special, I love it, but it's such a special sort of hell for me to watch my face.
It is a truly horrible thing to make someone do at the beginning of a live event, like just sit through. So, you know, I wanted to pick up on some of the ideas that you talked about in that video. You mentioned that obviously a collection of essays is very different to the memoir that H is for Hawk was. And I'd love for you to tell us more about like the move from one to the other. Like after you write a best-selling memoir, I'm sure everyone is asking you, can we have more of the same? And there are only so many, you know, books about a life-changing experience you've had with a hawk that you can write. So how do you then decide, okay, an essay is what a book of essays is what I'll do next?
Yeah, I've got a parrot now, Ed, as you know, so I had a lot of people saying, yes, for parrot next, and I kept saying no. And then there was this whole period where I decided I was going to tell everyone I was going to write erotic science fiction. That people just stared at me blankly. So how did I get to essays? Well, partly it was because I was writing at that time for the New York Times Magazine, and I was doing a column, and these pieces were appearing, and a lot of them were written on tour in quite stressful circumstances, on trains and in hotel rooms late, you know, very in the small hours as the deadline approached. So I wanted to revisit some of those, and but I think working with my editors at the magazine and working with editors elsewhere, I began to sort of see a way of writing about. I began to get really interested in the essay form, and I sort of thought it would be very nice to collect some of those together and write new ones, so that they're formally quite diverse in this collection. Some of them are very much kind of feature type articles, and others are more lyrical, and some of them are extremely short, like vignettes, and some of them are very personal. And I was worried when I put it together that actually I thought that they wouldn't fit together as a, you know, they would kind of fight with each other. But I was really surprised how there is a kind of arc to the book, and the same themes kept reappearing throughout. And I sort of felt a bit like, you know, there's sort of thinking about sort of someone like J.G. Ballard, not like comparing myself to him, but like, you know, he kind of wrote the same book 100 times. And I kind of love him for that. And I think my essays are a little bit like that. They might be about very different subjects, but the same things reappear in all of them. And I like that. I like also the sense that all of us in these terrible times I don't know about you, Ed, but my concentration span is shot. I can barely get through a TV program without wanting to check my phone or eat some toast. So I think there's something kind of, I feel gently happy that the essays are out there because they can be, you know, consumed singly and they don't take long. Hopefully in the mind and work on them.
It's funny you should say that. I've more or less lost the ability to read in any sort of prolonged, concentrated way this year. But I found I found Vesper Flights just delightful. It really was that exactly what you described, these bite-sized pieces of joy and wonder. But one thing I love about your writing is that you're so good at capturing the beauty and the wonder of nature, but also then deepening that with a really considered look at how our relationships manifest in nature, like how the way we think about nature reflects who we are, our cultural values, our politics. Can you say more about that? Like just bringing all of those aspects of humanity into your work on non-humans.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that is derived very directly from my time as an academic historian. I worked as a historian of science, you know, for many years, and I became so interested in the way in which we are, you know, taught to think that nature is entirely free of human concerns. It's this place with, you know, there's no politics and no class and then of course, you know, you watch any nature documentary and you think there's something going on here that I don't understand about, you know, the mummy leopard and her kids, you know. So I got really interested in that, and I started to see how clearly we use the natural world to prove our own understandings of the world back to ourselves. We do it all the time. And I think that this book in particular, I think there's a lot more politics in it, much more overt politics because of that. I think that the current situation, as you know, the climate emergency is such, and the impoverishment of biodiversity in a global sense. I just think it's crucial for us to try and think more clearly about why we value certain landscapes and creatures the way we do, and engage with the terms of those kinds of valuations. And because I'm British, there's a lot of class in the book too. So I'm trying, particularly in terms of kind of the hypocrisies about animal keeping, who has the right to define what nature is, who has the right to ask questions of it, and, you know, the different practices we use to take us to the natural world seem really fascinating, and I'm never going to stop being bored trying to unpick what they all are.
Can you give us an example of that? I mean, I've got one that I would love to like talk more about, the swans, which you've hinted at the videos, but, you know, I'm open to any other example you've got.
I could talk about swans for about 5 hours. Everyone, you know, they'd be turning off their screens one by one. You know, I had enough of this. So swans are fascinating. In fact, I was talking about swans yesterday and thinking about how they're really interesting birds because they so beautifully exemplify this dichotomy between a bird that's they're terrifying things. I mean, these brute creatures. Actually, I have a friend of mine, Patrick Wright, a historian, who famously once ran back to his mum crying when he was a boy because he said he'd been bitten by a snake. You know, he was by a river, and she said, "Oh my God, what was it like?" And he went, "It was white with an orange head." And she went, "Darling, that was a swan." You know,
more terrifying, much more terrifying.
Much more terrifying. But in Britain, they have this really astonishing cultural meaning, and that is they belong to the crown. And then for many, many, many centuries, they have been perceived of as, something to be like, they're not quite domestic animals, but they're not quite wild. They're in this weird trading zone. And there used to be these flocks called Games of Thrones. And, you know, you were given a Game of Thrones for your monastery or your stately home, and you used to collect all your young swans and mark them. They belong to you. And now we've got this weird situation in Britain where all the swans in Britain are either owned by the crown or owned by these two medieval guild companies. You know, we're so modern here. And every year there's this bizarre symbolic procession of boats with men wearing uniforms and feathers in their hats up the Thames, and they catch all the swans and mark them. And I went on it, and it was this, it was like a little trip into the imaginary nation. It was phenomenal watching how strongly animals can be used to pleat together all sorts of meanings that generally favor the powerful, of course. Yeah, and swans are just brilliant like that. I mean, there are all these stories in Britain of immigrants killing swans, and I got really interested in this. It turns out that they all seem to be totally apocryphal. And if you go back to kind of the 19th century, there are all these sort of stories about Jewish feather traders killing swans. It's always like there's always a sort of sense that the marginalized communities are the ones that somehow are threatening Britain's swans. It's so obvious, it's almost embarrassing to write about.
Right. Like, yeah, as a metaphor, it's pretty on the nose. Where like it was striking reading that essay, how the nature of like the immigrant group at fault always changes, but the swan as like this sort of stand-in for British nationalism under threat is always the same. And that connection between natural history and national history is just really fascinating. I said in other interviews I've seen that this political aspect of Vesper Flights, all you've written about class and privilege, are connections that you might have been too scared to make a few years ago, that it seems to be like very much of the moment. Can you say more about that? Like, have you sort of found a sort of newfound voice as a political commentator as well as a natural history writer?
Yeah, I'm just more angry now. I mean, things have been happening. I mean, things have always been there. They're just more. I mean, talk a bit more about this notion of the apocalypse as originally meaning not the end of days, but a revelation of things that have always been there, but suddenly just have become very obvious to our eyes. And yeah, things are grim, Ed, as you know. And I just thought, well, I mean, partly H's for Hawk was very much a memoir about personal grief. There was much less opportunity to be political in that, but
right.
I don't think it's possible to write now for me to write without trying to point. Of course, it's like there's a sort of terrific rainstorm outside. It's really, really kind of atmospheric. White noise in the background. I mean, I don't know. I just, I'm not a polemical writer, and I don't like, I'm not good at it. I'm not good at saying people, I'm a very contrary person. Ask my mother. If you ask me to do something, I'll do the opposite. So I'm not good at saying to people, this is how you should feel or think. I mean, I think that's a brilliant way of writing, but I can't do it. So what I want to do is say, look, this is how I think the world is built in some ways, and look how beautiful these things are, We need to attach ourselves to them and value them and fight for them. And I think outside the literary sphere, we should be organizing and making good trouble. I mean, that's just the work we should be doing. Yeah.
And how do you feel about the responsibility and the sort of the burden of doing nature writing at a time like this? And I guess by a time like this, I mean two things. Like, firstly, we're all in the middle of a pandemic, and it feels like you say in the video, the need for hope, the need for joy is so paramount, but also that nature is in a lot of trouble, and that a lot of these things that we get joy and wonder from, the stuff of the BBC natural history documentaries are in very bad shape. How do you weigh up these needs?
It's hard. I mean, I think, there are some very simple kind of rules I've given myself. One of which is just, call attention to things. There's this great line from one of Barry Lopez's essays about the stone horse encounters in the desert, and it being Barry Lopez, he sits and watches it as the sun goes down for hours, and it becomes this disquisition on life and meaning. But he uses this phrase, you have to know the names to be able to talk about the world. And one of my big things is that, there is an astonishing lack of natural history knowledge. Generally, it's not being taught. And if you look at the landscape on a macro scale, obviously if there's wildfires, things change extremely fast and terrifyingly. But generally, you know, it's a green blur. And if it's a green blur, you don't notice what's there and you don't notice what has gone. And so there's a lot of kind of specificity I try and bring out in the writing. In terms of kind of hope, I mean, I just, it's hard. It's you know, it's a discipline. You have to kind of, I always think of Rebecca Solnit talking about hope in the sense that if you're optimistic, you don't do anything. If you're pessimistic and full of despair, you don't do anything. You need to work really hard to make that space of uncertainty a future possibility in order that you can walk into it. And I think, you know, there are some positive things happening in terms of certain areas in conservation practice. You know, rewilding is really interesting. There are some success stories. And I think, you know, it's just important to keep hold of some of those and think about, for example, there's an estate in Britain called the Knepp Estate. I'm sure you know of. It was a farm. They've turned it into a sort of rewilding project. And what has made me really happy is to witness how extraordinarily rapidly biodiversity rockets up if things are sort of left a little bit alone. And things like that keep me going, you know, despite the fact that systemic breakdown is happening. I just have to keep thinking of the ways in which the natural world can adapt and shift in response to local conditions. Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the essays that I loved in the book was the one about the peregrines, because I think it's so, you know, for anyone who hasn't read it yet, there's a lovely essay about Helen watching peregrine falcons in an industrial area, and I love it because it's such a great counterpoint to this idea that nature and humans must be sort of kept apart if the former is to thrive, that, you know, they have to be sort of walled off in these wilderness areas. But actually, you know, the urban falcons are such a great symbol of the ability to coexist, which feels like a really important thing to be pursuing in this future, where clearly we aren't going anywhere, and we sort of need to create conditions where wildlife can coexist with us. Can you say more about that? How you're thinking about that coexistence?
Yeah, it's really important, I think, for certain kinds of species that can cope with our presence, and important for us, I think, emotionally and cognitively. I think it makes us bigger to have contact with creatures that are not us, in all sorts of ways. I have a little bit of a worry about there seems to be a little bit of fetishization of what is known in this country in nature writing parlance as edgelands. So there is a sort of sense that people get really obsessed with kind of, you know, the back of a kind of an allotment, or behind an industrial estate, there's a kind of scrubby bit of grass with 3 or 4 trees. You know, these become these kind of symbols of nature survival. And of course, most of these are deeply impoverished systems with very, you know, they're not as good as, for example, you know, an extensive forest or you know, I always think of the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea as one of the most nature zones in the, you know, well, but I think it's important to think about those places as being useful for us, really. And I'm very worried about this notion that in order to, it's very commonly held, and it happens a lot during the early pandemic, this notion you could go out on your own to the countryside and somehow seek solace in the wilderness, and obviously a very charged term. And I just kept thinking of everyone living in inner cities with limited financial capital, not able to get out into the countryside, and thought, like, how do you interact with the natural world? What does it do for you? And I always think of the spiders in my house. I mean, there's a lot of them. I'm not very housebound, you know, and there are kinds of things that you can do that I think are important. This is a very human-centered argument, but, you know, we need to work our empathy muscles a bit more. And I think, you know, when I think about Iris Murdoch and this concept of unselfing, she sort of says that if you look at an animal very hard, if you're full of worries and care, it's not that you can run away to the hills to feel better. It's that you can sort of look so hard at an animal that you can almost become it. The world fills with the animal. And then when you come back to yourself, your own concerns are just a little bit more, you can bear them a little better. And I think that sort of animal encounter is available to anyone, no matter where they are. And I think that's really important. Yeah. That didn't. Yeah. I just went off on one. Sorry.
No. This is great. I mean, it's an area that's very, very close to my heart. I've been spending a lot of time before writing about pandemic stuff, thinking about the sensory worlds of other animals, and you know, how thinking about how very different creatures perceive the same world that we inhabit. And just the different kinds of information they're getting from that it's sort of a radical act of empathy that, you know, of the kind that we're sadly lacking in at the moment. And, you know, I know that you mentioned some of these ideas in your book as well. I was hoping you could say more about this idea of, like, you know, watching nature and appreciating nature as fundamentally an act of empathy.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a big fan of empathy. It's a really interesting history, art history, but I think in terms of just trying to extend one's imaginative world into the mind of another and see what the world might be like for them. Obviously, I think if you exercise it with animals, you can do it with people too. So it's an exercise, and I think. Well, I was going to go somewhere with that. It's completely disappeared from my head. Yeah. So let me just. So the animals are so full of meanings for us. You know, I always think of that astonishing Annie Dillard essay on the weasel, where I don't know if I'm sure some of you have read that. It's very famous. One of the things you get at school, where she locks eyes with this predatory mustelid, and she sort of says in this essay, which is a phenomenal essay, that you know. I was in that weasel's head and it was in mine for a moment. And I always thought that was the most exciting and extraordinary, because it seemed to me that, you know, sometimes you can look past all the meanings that we've given an animal. You can just sort of almost by mistake look past them and see this alien, astonishing, non-human person really sort of sitting there looking at you. And it's this recognition of difference and communication across that boundary. But then the essay says, you know, if only I were like a weasel, I could go after what I wanted. And there's this whole Nietzschean kind of, you know,
right.
And I'm like, no, because of course, you know, all I think is, you know, I worship her work, and I think she's an astonishing writer and you know, deep thinker. But I just think there could be so many other stories you could have put in the head of that weasel. You know, that could have been a weasel that had hits. That could have been a weasel that had a hurt leg. You know, there are so many other stories that you could choose to see there. So I think empathy with an animal is always also an act of self-examination, and I think that's part of what's important about it. Yeah, I feel like I've really dissed her now. I'm sorry, Annie. You're amazing.
No, it's interesting though, right? Because it's hard to hold all of these things in your head at the same time. Like on the one hand, trying to really grasp the natural history of the creatures that you're looking at. And sort of thinking about the world through their eyes, like understanding that there are such differences between their perceptions and cognition and yours, but also then like trying to remember, as you said, that we have imbued so much meaning, we have laden these creatures with so many stories from our own lives. Yeah. And it's difficult, I think, it's a difficult balancing act to be cognizant of all of these different aspects of animals all at once.
It's really hard, and it's possibly impossible. I'm sure it's impossible. So one of the things I raise in the book is how I sort of look back in that way that obnoxious historians do to sort of 16th century emblematic natural histories. So and it was the kind of time I talk about how, you know, the epistemologies, the ways we have knowledge of animals now, they're very tightly constrained and they kind of separate from each other. So there is, you know, the scientific, which is, you know, has a certain cachet and is, you know, burningly important, as, you know, it's required, but it tends to also, there's a sort of sense that one isn't allowed to also at the same time have other conceptions. So, you know, these emblematic natural histories, what they would be is they would not only put forward a natural history of the creature in question, but they would also bring in what the spiritual, what the individual, what the kind of historical, what the, you know, all the other kinds of meanings that these, and the medical, these creatures have, and put it in one place. And I kind of love that as a programmatic way of thinking about animals now. It's like, you know, yes, we need science more than ever to understand not only the lives of these creatures, but how they're connected to others, and how to, you know, model and preserve, you know, what systems are left. But we also need the other stuff too, because that's what's driving us to want to keep things going, to want to preserve those places and those creatures. I am getting polemical. I'm doing it live.
Yeah, do it more. So, all right, I'm gonna push this button a little bit more, because I do think that, you know, so much has said about like the need for like science communication and you know, getting people who aren't interested in natural history to be more cognizant of that. But I think much less is said about the need of getting people with a scientific background to be more aware of like the historical aspects of the things that they're studying, the sociological aspects. I feel I said in an interview recently that like if the pandemic has radicalized me on any one thing, it's the need for people with like a science background to actually have more of a humanities training too. And it sounds like, you know, this sort of reminds me of what you've just been talking about, that there are these different ways of considering the creatures around us. And I feel like sometimes people who look at it from more of a like purely scientific lens are missing out all these other sort of cultural and sociological contexts that you are grappling with in the book.
Yeah, and this has always been a subject of deep fascination for me, because talking with, I mean, again, I'm talking mainly with biologists, I think, mainly with biologists who are working in they're mainly field biologists. So my sample is pretty skewed, but generally, you know, the deep emotional connections that those people have with their organisms and with the places that they're working in are, I mean, they're just phenomenal, and they drive the research. It's just that they're not in the papers, you know, they're not in the literature, and I always sort of feel this sort of slightly sort of painful about that there's no kind of sense that a kind of more anthropological reflexive way of thinking about writing about the natural world that would bring in both of those narratives could operate in a more kindly manner, because oh my God, look at me trying to change science here. This is terrible. I mean, you know, I worry because, you know, my background is in the history of science. I did a lot of work in the sociology of science, and taught it. And of course, there is this sense to me, it's very clear to me from that background, that science is massively inflected with an enormous amount of social content. You know, who gets to ask the questions, what those questions are. It's you know, this is just the way it works. You know, you know, we talk about objectivity, but science, you know, is shaped by the places it's done in and who does it. And of course, what happened then was this horrifying thing where a lot of that tradition in the history of science and the philosophy of science became recruited by kind of climate change deniers who were like, oh, none of it's true. You know? It's all just, you know, it's all fake, you know. So, I mean, I think it's a little bit scary to talk about science as being shaped by things other than logic or truth. There's other things you want to know, because it does lay one open to that worry that you're letting a bit of air in that could be colonized by bad faith actors. So it's tricky to write about that. Yeah, but yeah. I mean, you know, people who do Drosophila have obsessions with flies, and people who do otters have obsessions with otters, and they just talk about it with their other otter people, not to each other.
I love that this collection of essays seems to draw from like just the fullness of like your experience. You know, you've talked about being a historian of science, obviously a keen natural historian, a falconer yourself, an animal owner and aficionado. Like it feels like that has contributed to just how enriching and multifaceted the essays are, just that like wealth and diversity of personal experience.
Yeah, writing about oneself memoir-wise is odd. I mean, people who've read H.S. Hawke will know me as a very miserable 30-something. But there are other bits of me in this that I'm actually quite embarrassed about. There's the kind of, there's a very strange child who's catching snakes, and there's the very miserable university student, and then there's the very depressed, weird person working on a falcon breeding farm in Wales. I think in terms of sort of the form, again, it goes back to that sense that in order to show the biases that I have. I want to show the reader who I am. You know, I have this upbringing, I have this experience, my educational experience. There's a lot of biases and privileges going on. And I just think in order to be honest about that, I've got to say, look, I was this kind of strange child and with a hunger for the natural world. And that's, you know, I turned into this, and I hate being bored. And my life has been very various, and it's been very exciting. And I don't know, I think it's, I don't like to preach. I'd like to say to the reader, look, come along, look at this thing I found. It's amazing. You know, I mean, it might bore people when I do that in real life, but I hope with the poetic language, it might not be quite as boring when I do it on page.
Well, it's certainly not. And I feel like that's also a good segue to doing a reading. If you wanted to do a reading, are there any passages in the, yeah?
Yeah, I'd love to. Shall I do a sort of more poetic-y reading? So as the book cover, look at me holding it up. This amazing image by Chris Wormel of a European, a common swift. Arpus arpus, so named because their feet are so small, they're almost invisible. They can't walk really, and they can't take off from the ground. If they land, their wings are so long. They're just like sort of herring in the ocean really when it comes to their aerial nature. And when the young birds leave the nest, they don't touch anything for about 2-3 years. They just fly continually, like fish in the sea. So I have a friend called Judith who rears orphan swifts. And what's astonishing about that is that when she's rearing them, the young birds are astonishingly cuddly. They kind of like stick to each other. They preen each other, they squeak. They're like little soft toys with these weird long wings. And then there's this moment where you release them. They've never flown before. And you hold them up like this into the wind, and you wait for them to take their first flight. And this is what it was like. It was extraordinary. We're on a cricket pitch in an English village. It's very Midsummer Murders. So I'm meeting with this swift, which has never flown before. It stares into the wind for a while, then starts shivering. Anticipation, I think. Functional explanations. This bird is warming up its pectoral muscles ready for flight. Emotional explanations. Anticipation, wonder, joy, terror. The sensitive philo plumes growing between the feathers of its wings and sleek sides are being brushed by the breeze, feeling their element for the first time. Nothing has visibly changed, but something is happening. Like an aircraft avionics system coming online as it powers up, blinking lights, engine check, check. But that doesn't work though, not quite as an analogy, because what I am watching is a new thing making itself out of something else. There is no doubt in my mind, this is as much a transformation as a dragonfly larva crawling from water and tearing itself out into a thing with wings. On my open palm, a creature whose home has been paper towels and plastic boxes is turning into a different creature whose home is thousands of miles of air. Then the swift decides. It tilts the pug-sharp tiny tip of its beak upwards, arches its back. I can't help do the movements, it's really embarrassing. And drops from my flattened palm, making an aching series of stiff and creaky wing beats. For 5 or 6 seconds, everything feels wrong. The bird is a mere foot above the grass and my heart is beating fast. Up, 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 calls Judith. But nothing is broken. We are just watching a bird learning to fly. Pitching as if pulling into gear, the swift starts to ascend, flickering up and up into a sky streaked with evening cirrus. It describes one careful circle above our heads, then lifts even higher and straight lines it to the south. I look down at my palm. There's a little scratch on the meat of my thumb where its claws had gripped tight before letting me go, gripped tight to the hand that was the last solid thing the bird would touch for years. It's a very emotional moment.
Oh, all right. I need more wine.
You've got wine, haven't I got wine? I should do wine. But yeah, no, that was astonishing. And Swift's really, to me, I mean, the title says, you know, in the book, Vesper Flights is really, it seems to be now about the pandemic, and before the pandemic ever happened. It's, you know, it's about trusting in expertise and trusting in others to look for what's coming on the horizon. And we knew it was coming. We all knew it was coming, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's it's such a beautiful passage. I was thinking when you were reading it, my favorite Swift fact, which I'm not actually sure is true now because bird phylogeny seems to change almost on a daily basis.
It's a nightmare, yeah.
But I believe that the swifts are most closely related to hummingbirds.
Yeah.
Which is so bizarre. Like, you know, on the one hand, one group of birds that has like scythes for wings and has, you know, gone for speed and agility. And then on the other hand, another group of birds that just, you know, does almost the exact opposite.
They both go into kind of suspended animation, don't they? They can both kind of switch themselves up, which is one. Look at us debating. That's really, really cool. I love hummingbirds. One of the great sadnesses in my life is there are no hummingbirds and no geckos in England. I think that's basically it. Apart from the political situation, that's my main worry.
That's right. The second worst thing about 2020.
There's no hummingbirds. But the thing about the hummingbird fact that I adore, we could do this for hours. We're just going to get facts now, everyone. It's like Popular Mechanics magazine in the 1950s. Here's a fact. So it was when they discovered that hummingbirds don't just drink nectar, they spend a lot of time licking aphids off trees with their tongue. I just think it's so great. It's like, oh, okay, they eat insects as well. Okay, that's good to know.
That's amazing. All right, so I'm about to go to questions, but I cannot resist this exchange because I also have a good hummingbird fact. So there's a woman named Margaret Rubega in Cornell who did this amazing study on how hummingbirds drink. And for the longest time, everyone thought that it was just capillary action. So the tongue goes into the flower, and then much like just you put a thin straw into some liquid, it'll it turns out it is not that. When the tongue hits the nectar, it splits in two.
Like a butterfly tongue.
Yeah, and it's got these flanges at the tip that unfurl, and then as it pulls the tongue back, the flanges close. So it's like two hands shooting out, grabbing like a fistful of nectar, and then pulling it back into the bird's face.
Okay, that's it. I can't answer any questions now. I'm just gobsmacked. That is amazing, and also reminds me of the aliens in Arrival.
Right. Yeah.
That's amazing. I'm now quite freaked out by hummingbirds. I don't know if I can look at them ever again. That's incredible.
All right. I am going to go to some questions. If anyone watching has more questions, please put them in the Q&A. We've got a few already that are great. One I'm going to ask you first off, because it may take you a while to remember the answer to this, but were there any ideas or stories that didn't make it into the final copy of the book and that you wanted to share? And any kernels or micro stories that didn't have enough mileage for an essay, but were still meaningful to you?
Oh, that's hard. So there were some that didn't go in because they just didn't fit, and there was one that was a Star Wars essay that I really loved. And it was about nostalgia and Star Wars and nostalgia. I mean, that was kind of what it was about. I went to the in 1977. I'm so old. I went to the Leicester Square with my mum and dad and my little brother. I think was babysitting me, and I had my first ever chocolate eclair at a restaurant. It was amazing. And I remember looking up and seeing these flocks of starlings, back in those days when they used to roost in central London. They were very much more common there, and the first time I ever saw a murmuration. And in my mind, Star Wars and Tatooine and starlings are all kind of, and it ended up in this whole kind of exposition about sort of fans and repurposing works. I thought it was really fun. But then I put it in this book, and it was a bit like having this sort of huge plate of like savory pastries, and then there was a cheesecake in the middle. It just didn't fit. So I had to take it out. But that was the only one I think that I'm kind of a bit sad that, and maybe it wasn't as good as it wasn't that good as well actually. But never mind. It was fun to write. And there were other smaller things that I didn't put in. I liked the little small pieces, but they didn't. They just didn't fit. They didn't feel right in the place. I took them out. Don't worry. All writers. You know what writers are like. If there's stuff they can rework. They will all appear somewhere. Don't worry.
That's right. Yeah, you dear questioner, will find the answer to this question in a future Helen Macdonald book. Yeah. Okay. This is lovely. So Amy asks, I adored H is for Hawk, one of my favorite books of all time. Quite right. In it, you seem to achieve what I think is the desire for all artists, for the innermost being to sing or to scream even. Is this one of the things you are going for? That scream, that identification with essential being, grief, joy, transcendence? It's very lovely.
Yeah, it was weird. So when I first started writing it, I'm going to have recourse to terrible national stereotypes here, and I apologize in advance. When I started writing it, I was very, very English about it. I thought it was going to be a book mainly about the hawk and less about me. So I didn't really want to go into how I was feeling, which seems ridiculous now looking back on it. And the book wouldn't work. I kept trying to write, and then it was like running into a brick wall over it. It was like Eeyore running into a tree. I just couldn't do it. And then one day that I started to write something, and I realized that it was the first time I'd written anything that had that absolute cut from rock honesty, that total honoring how I really felt, with absolutely vulnerable, absolutely fearless. I mean, the fact that 7 years had gone past made it easier, and as soon as I did that, I thought, oh, of course, readers know, I know, readers know, I have to be honest. And that was hard, but also much easier than trying to dissemble. And I've tried to keep it like that. I've tried to, what's the word if we can't be vulnerable to each other? If we're in a situation where we're safe enough to be vulnerable to each other, then that's what we should be doing. And that's what I try to do in my work. Yeah. And I'm a sentimental softie as well. So
yeah, I love what you said about how having several years of distance was important there. My wife runs this, was formerly executive director of a storytelling organization, and one of the things they often said was that you need some distance from experiences of grief or trauma to actually be able to tell that story. You can't do it if it's like something that just happened yesterday. Do you feel that the time made a difference to the way that story was told?
I do. It's a really great observation. And what an amazing thing for her to do. That's so cool. So I think there are two kinds of ways of writing about grief or any kind of really intense experience. One of them is a sort of battlefield way. You write right in it. And I think Joan Didion's The Year of Magical Thinking is an absolutely extraordinary example of that. Now, that book really is written in the middle of this total experience. It's very dizzying to read. It's hard to read. It's beautiful and very, very deep and serious. I couldn't do that. So, and what happened was, as that time goes past, obviously what happens is your memory sort of sorts things out, and a lot of the ways you could write about it kind of disappear. It's a bit like your brain, a lot of things, as networks go, you have a much clearer sense of what the story was. And also, more importantly for me, I could look back on myself and as a character, and I could write myself as a character. So a lot of the time writing that book, it was me typing, remembering with crystalline clarity what it felt like to be that person, but at the same time going, you're an idiot. There was some distance there that made that possible. At the beginning of that book, I don't know very much. I'm quite stupid about a lot of things. By the end, there's a bit of hard-won knowledge, and it was interesting to try and write that process.
That actually makes me think of something else I wanted to ask you about. Like I have experience of like being in the field or in a lab, like watching something happen and sort of furiously taking notes on it. And there are so many essays in the book where you're describing something that really is like taking place, in the matter of like a few seconds and viewed through like binoculars, often at a great distance. And yet there's so much rich detail, and it's almost like everything, the action sort of slows down to a crawl. You're describing it in such a rich and dense way. Like, how do you do that?
I don't know. How do I do that? I don't know. I started off writing poetry, and there's I don't know. I think partly for many years I wanted to be an artist. So whenever I look at something, there's always a lot of work going on in my head about color values and how those work. And also I quite like scent and perfume. So there's a lot of sensory stuff. But I think it's that, you know, those moments, those very charged moments, as you know, if you have those moments, not necessarily watching some, you know, writing notes in a lab, that might not be the same, but certainly those moments in the natural world where something astonishing happens, there's an enormous amount of information there that can be impacted afterwards. I mean, honestly, if you ask me to write what I've done today, I don't think I could write more than about half a paragraph, apart from this, you know, rich but I think, you know, the emotional impact of an event, particularly if it's surprising, it's a little bit like a traumatic event, only good. So like, you know, certainly if I've had near misses in my car, for example, I know that, you know, certainly that sense of time slowing, the relative time slowing is very, very clear. And I think that happens a little bit with some of the things I've seen in the natural world. So yeah. I don't know is the answer to that question. But yeah, it's interesting.
All right, I'm going to pivot to something a bit lighter. Sarah would like to know, do you have a favorite swan fact?
Do I have a favorite swan fact? Oh my goodness. I think it's the Peter Scott story. It's not really a fact about swans like me. It's a story about people and swans. Peter Scott was, we know, was a very important person figure in the world of sort of wildfowl studies, and he was a painter and painted the same picture of wildfowl a million times. And you know, he even had his soft furnishings upholstered in fabric that was printed with his pictures of waterfowl. He was amazing. And he had this redemptive story that he was a wildfowl. He shot them, and then one day he shot something and realized he didn't want to do it anymore and became this conservationist. And he noticed that these birds, these Buick swans that came over from behind the Iron Curtain during the Cold War to spend the winter in Britain, they all had individual patterns of yellow and black on their beaks that meant you could individually identify each swan. And what happened was that, you know, every winter they'd come over from Russia and he'd give them names like kind of, you know, Churchill and Victoria. And then he'd like do these kind of family trees, and it was called the Facebook. He had these pictures of all these swans. And there's something about that story about him desperately kind of trying to give these birds kind of Western identities before they went back to Russia every year. And there seemed to be something, you know, he was a kind of conservative MP, you know, we're talking, you know, not a very liberal sensibility there. And I just love the sense that he was sort of recruiting these birds into a sort of, you know, Little England version of a kind of village life and giving them all families and names and individual identities. And then they go back to the faceless Soviet wastes. I just thought it was a fascinating story. That's I think my favorite fact about swans. Well, that's not really a fact about swans, it's kind of a story. So I didn't answer that question. I'm sorry.
No, I love it. I love it. So crossing the ocean, Elizabeth wanted you to say something about the essay about the birds you watched at the Empire State Building. She says, it's horrifying to me how much destruction we cause with lights. And this is something that it seems like something we would collectively change upon getting this kind of information.
It is astonishingly frightening, the toll that is taken. Cats and lighted buildings on migration pathways. I mean, cats are the main problem. Lights are bad. And at the moment, obviously, we have these terrifying die-offs that seem to be, you know, I've seen images recently of, you know, sand banks with just hundreds and hundreds of dead swallows that we thought was to do with the wildfires, but looks more likely to be a climatic cold snap, that they all starved. There weren't enough insects for them. There's some scary things going on. We can do our bit. So yeah, the Empire State Building, the most unlikely place to watch birds, completely changed my view of New York, of cities, of everything, of the sky. And there I was looking up from the observation deck into a sky that uplit by these bodies of tiny birds that you couldn't see from the ground, and they look like tracer fire, you know, these tiny birds going over. But every so often they'd be pulled into the lights and they'd get trapped. And this guy, Andrew Farnsworth, that I was there with, is amazing. You know, he's one of the people that stops every year when the tribute in light goes up, the September the 11th tribute, you know, these great columns of light, you know. I don't know if you've seen the images this year. It was a really strong night. You know, those things go up into the sky. They're seen for miles and they just pull birds towards them. And there are these images of this sort of like this column of, you know, and there are so many small warblers and birds in it that it looks like it's just like confetti, like paper, like a ticker tape parade. And he gets to shut them off and let the birds go on. And there's something about that image of these souls trapped in the light and then released to continue somewhere else that I think is one of the most devastating images of love and longing and nostalgia and loss and remembrance and the damage we do, but also the good we can do. It's everything in one. So yeah, turn your windows off, turn your lights off. I mean, at night. That's the message. And I think increasingly there are programs that are doing just that, and they're very, very effective. So yeah.
Who are your favorite natural history writers?
Oh, it's really hard, this question, because
I know. I'm going to stall a little bit to give you time to think, because usually when I get asked this question, I forget the name of literally every person I've ever met in my life. So it's horrible.
I'm really fickle as well. I mean, I just, very changeable. One of my favorite writers is actually very, very, not very well known, and his name was Roger Langley, R.F. Langley. He was mainly a poet, and he lived in a little village. I'm so insular, about an hour and a half from here. And he wrote a series of journals about the natural world, and and they are astonishing. I mean, he has a sensibility of a poet, and he'll do something like, that I try to do, but I can't do like him. He'll see a little kind of springtail insect walk across a railway bridge, not knowing that the trains are going underneath, and he says things like, it will never be seen by anyone who has words again. And then suddenly it becomes a kind of disquisition on eternity and life and humanity and Hamlet. And you're like, oh my God, how do you do that? So journals by R.F. Langley, if you can get hold of that, that's an amazing book. And recently I've been going absolutely bonkers over Braiding Sweetgrass, which I've read again, and Robin Timmerer, and how this notion of nature is a place of reciprocity rather than, there's a phrase in there where she talks about how she told her students once this, what would it be like for you if you believed the earth loved you back, and it just led to this total meltdown. Everyone couldn't really deal with that notion, and it's a really helpful one to think. So, and also J. Drew Lanham, I really recommend this book, The Home Place. It's absolutely astonishing book, and it's about a Black naturalist. He's the most extraordinary biologist, ornithologist, but also lyrical writer. It's really great. So look at me waving books at everyone. Just, just read everything. And Shakespeare's good too. I recommend Shakespeare, she said obnoxiously.
I'm pretty, so I was looking over my shoulder because I'm pretty sure Braiding Sweetgrass is here somewhere. Yours is there.
No, don't. I
can see it.
There. It's embarrassing. Look at that.
And I'm pretty sure I'm annoyed now that I can't find it, but it's somewhere. All right. I am going to wrap this up with one more question, which is, hopefully everyone here is going to buy Vesper Flights. I'm absolutely convinced that if you do, you will love it. I'd love to hear from you, like what you hope people will get from the book, like what someone who turns over the last page is going to walk away with.
Apart from, boy, Helen is a weird one. I think I was once spoken to by a man who had a terrible loss after H's for Hawk, and he said to me, "Thank you," and I said, "Oh, well, blah, embarrassment, thank you," and he said, "I didn't know it was okay to go mad after you'd lost someone you loved," and I was like, "Oh, it was a moment." And I think I gave him a hug back when hugs were allowed. It was a very intense moment. And I think with this book, I think to notice, if this book just leads some people who read it to just go out there, and when they see a bug on the ground, they're not like, it's a bug, but go, what's that bug doing? What is it? Why is it here? Just ask some questions and try and imagine what it's like to be a bug. I don't know, just exercise that empathy a bit and love what's there. And I think that it's really important to think that, what's out there is for all of us. It's not, the boundaries that make us think we're not allowed to interact with the natural world are very heavily policed, and some of them aren't needed at all. It's for everyone. And the ways that we interact with it are very various, and the practices we use to interact with it are various. And I think we shouldn't be ashamed. You can look at pigeons as well as resplendent quetzals, and it's yours too. Yeah.
That's lovely. Thank you so much for all of that, for the book, for chatting to us tonight. I certainly loved it, and I hope everyone else did too. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you, everyone.
was so wonderful. We could have kept going. Thank you for coming to PNP Live. Stay well read, take care of yourselves, and vote. See you later.
Yeah.